Assalamu alaikum students. I hope all of you are doing great. Uh, our today's lecture is about how to code effectively in CSS essay, in English essay. Okay, uh, the word which is important here is effectively. Students put the codes in their essay, a lot of times, but they make a lot of mistakes when quoting. Okay, it's not just that you're writing an essay and all of a sudden you drop a quote and it's like hitting a hammer on the examiner's head. Okay, so in order for a quote to be effective, you have to write it effectively, and there are various methods in which you can properly embed your quotes. You can write your quote effectively so that the quote conveys the meaning to the examiner. The quote strengthens your stance. You're basically quoting different authorities just to tell the examiner that what you are saying, or what your proposition is, what your stance is actually true. Okay, and it is not just you, but many other people hold it true. And by other people, I mean the authorities on different subjects. For example, if you are writing about global warming, then you can quote some authority who has worked a lot in global warming. Okay, so quotes should be by different authorities, but there is a proper methodology to quoting effectively. There are grammatical constructs when it comes to quoting effectively, but students don't bother about those, but the examiner is bothering. He is watching, he is observing each and everything, that whether you're following grammatical rules or not. So today it's all about let's move on to next slide, and I will tell you what our today's lecture is all about. But at a very brief level, you can say that it's about how to code effectively. Okay, all students code, but they don't know how to code effectively. That is how to gain the most benefit out of a code which you have memorized and which you are able to recall at the exam day. But even if you do quote it, you're not reaping the full dividends of that code, then it's futile to quote. Okay, so that is what our today's lecture is all about. So moving on, our today's lecture will be about, first of all, we will discuss what a quote is, why do we use a quote, types of writing in which we use the quotes, IQE rule. This is very, very, very important. Okay, you have to keep in mind whenever you are quoting. Okay, IQE: introduction, quotation, and explanation. Okay, I will discuss it in detail. What does this mean? Introducing the quotes and explaining the quotes. Okay, I don't need to elaborate on these things here because I will be discussing each of these things in this lecture. So uh, without further ado, let's move on. Quotation. Okay, the word quote is short form of quotation. This is self-evident. A quotation is a group of words, remember, from a text used and repeated by someone other than the original author. That is, you are someone who is using and repeating the text of some other author. Okay, effectively you're copying the words of someone else. Okay, it could be an excerpt from a book, it could be words from a famous speech or something like that. Okay, so it's not, quote is not your words. These are the words of someone else. So when you are putting someone else's words in your write up, then there is there is a grammatical order to it. Okay, you can't just put in drop in code just like the rest of the essay. No, that's not done like that. There are proper rules to it. Okay, and that is going to be the focus of our topic today. Okay, where the quotes are used, in what circumstances we quote here: in informational essays and compositions. Remember, these are the forms of writings in which quotations are used most often. In informational essays and compositions, once again, these are part of our CSS essay category. Typical causes, effect, solutions essays. In argumentative essays, once again, these are also part of our CSS essays. And persuasive essays, these are once again part of our essays. Literary responses and analysis, essays. Now these are not included in our literary responses or literary critiques. These are not part of our essay. Our essay's domain doesn't touches these areas. It doesn't touch these areas. But there are literary essays. Okay, literary or proverbial essays. Literary or proverbial essays, which are often tested in CSS exams, and there also you can use quotes. Then there are research papers in which, if you have read any research paper about democracy or anything for that matter, there you would also see that a lot of quotations are used. But these two are outside a domain. But since I were talking about the forms of the writings in which quotations are used, then I just thought it might be appropriate to tell you the writing forms in which quotations are used. Moving on. Properly including quotations in your writing helps support your ideas, okay, and improve the quality of your writing. One, it naturally improves the quality of writing. When you include the words of some wise people or some people who are expert on any subject, then it improves the quality of your writing. It tells the examiner that you have in-depth knowledge about the topic which you are discussing in your essay. Okay, secondly, quotes are used to, the main purpose of quotes is to support your ideas. Okay, for example, if you are let's suppose writing something about democracy and you are quoting Thomas Jefferson. Okay, he has a very famous quote. He was a former president of US, as all of you might know. He's very renowned for his famous quote that information is the currency of democracy. Okay, let's suppose you're discussing something about things which make democracy effective. So one of the reasons could be that a well informed citizenry is a prerequisite for effective democracy. I mean, if citizens are well informed, okay, only then they can make informed decisions, and if they are making informed decisions, only then can democracy be effective. Only then democracy can can yield dividends. So in that aspect, you can quote Thomas Jefferson, and his quote is that information is the currency of democracy. Okay, so the sole purpose of quotes is to support your ideas. When you are coming up with some uh, thesis or stance, then you support it. And you how you support it, you tell the examiner that some different authorities have also, they also hold the same beliefs. Okay, so you provide sufficient and relevant evidence to support and explain your ideas and claim. Just what I discussed. To protect yourself from plagiarism. Now, if you're using someone else's words, don't don't pretend that they are your own words. Okay, and to demonstrate the ability to include outside sources. Now this once again reflects to the examiner that the candidate has maturity when it comes to formal writing. Okay, that he can effectively quote outside authorities just to strengthen his claims, his ideas, his stance. So that is also an ability. Okay, and it shows that the candidate is mature. He has studied other authorities, and he can embed other authorities or their quotes or their famous sayings in his write up. Moving on. So students know that they have to write the quotes, but believe me, they write the quotes wherever they want them. Okay, they just drop in quotes everywhere in their write ups. But no, there is a there are also rules where you should be putting the quotes. Okay, your quotes should be in your body paragraphs. Okay, now some students might might be thinking that, okay, what about introduction, what about conclusion? I'll be discussing that also. But the sole purpose of your quotes is to prove a point with and through research. Okay, so the sole purpose of your quotes should be to prove a point. And where are you proving the points? in the body paragraphs. Remember, in the introductory paragraph, you have taken a stance. And now throughout the essay in your body paragraphs, you are defending that stance. You are defending your position. You are proving a point if you have taken a point. Okay. Let's suppose the topic is that global warming is the most crucial threat to world. Then throughout your essay, you are proving that point. And how you're and where do you prove your points? In the body paragraph. So principally your quotes should be in the body paragraphs. Okay, but avoid, but there is a certain caveat to it. Okay, avoid using quotes in the introduction, thesis statement and conclusion unless you are using them for an attention getter. Okay, within the introduction. Now you can use the quotes in introduction and concluding paragraph, but only if they are, making, they are to make your write up stand out from the rest of the lot. Okay, they are acting as attention getters. Now how can they be attention getters? If they are, hitting the topic right at its head. Okay, they are directly related to your thesis statement. Okay, so only then use quotes in introduction and conclusion. Otherwise just use your quotes, use the quotes to support your ideas in the body paragraphs. And remember, the thesis statement should never be a quote. It should be your own words. Okay, and I hope you have watched the previous lectures and you know what the thesis statement is about. So I don't have to, but just let me know you that thesis statement is the stance which you have taken, the main proposition, the crux of your essay, that what you are going to talk about in your essay. But that should be your own words. You shouldn't be replacing it with a quote. I have seen the students that they give the heading in the outline, introduction, and they write a quotation here, but that is not how things are done. You have to write it in your own words here. Okay, your thesis statement, you have to write thesis statement in your own words. I'll be discussing where you should be putting thesis statement. Okay, I have a different lecture, dedicated to frequently asked questions from different aspirants. Don't worry if you have any queries. If you have any queries about a particular lecture, you can drop them in your in the comment section in this video lecture. Okay, but we're deviating from the topic, I guess. So the main the crux of this is that the quotes should be used to justify your stance. Okay, but only use them in introduction and conclusion if they are acting as an attention getter. And how they can get as an attention getter? Only if they are relevant to the thesis statement of your essay. Remember, quotes are best used to support your own analysis. Don't just drop them anywhere. Have purpose in where they go. Okay, so if you just drop the quotes in the introduction or in the concluding paragraph without any purpose, that examiner won't penalize you for that, but they won't be serving any purpose. Okay, they won't be any good for you. But even though the examiner won't penalize you, because the sole purpose of the course is to support your own analysis. Okay, and where you can best do this? In the body paragraphs. Now I will tell you what is there is a proper format to how to quote in a body paragraph, but for now let's move on. Avoid using, so these are some simple tips. Avoid using long quotes to take up space. Okay, quotes can be shortened. Now how I will be discussing it in later on, that if you have memorized a very long quote, and a topic comes up in the essay, and some of the quote is of that quote is related to the essay or the thesis statement, but some of it is not, then you don't have to write the entire quote of, let's suppose, 5 to 6 sentences. You can shorten that quote, and there is once again a grammatical rule to it, that how you can shorten a quote. And you can only write the relevant part and omit the irrelevant part. Okay, make your paper sound like it came from you. Okay, don't fill it with quotes. Quotes should be used for support of what you are writing about it. Let the examiner hear your voice. Okay, so let the examiner know that this analysis is coming from you, and this analysis is strengthened by quotes. Don't just fill up the whole answer sheet, okay, with quotes. No, that is not how it is. Okay, that will, believe me, that will irritate the examiner. You can use as many quotes as you want, but they should be used to support your ideas. Okay, moving on. You know, this is once again a summary. Include your quotes when you're providing examples and evidence. Okay, just to prove your points. Okay, when you're proving your points, you provide quotes. Don't include quotes when you're writing your thesis statement, because as I mentioned, the thesis statement should be your own words. You know, if even if a quote is directly hitting the thesis statement, I mean, it is just like a thesis statement, even then you shouldn't quote. Okay, you can mention it elsewhere, but the thesis statement should be your own words, because you should let the examiner know that what is your take on a particular topic. Okay, you're writing your topic sentences. Now topic sentence, as I discussed earlier, is the topic of a particular paragraph. It is the first sentence in a paragraph, and that once again shouldn't be a quote. The first sentence of the paragraph, of a body paragraph, should be your own writing. Okay, now I'll discuss it in detail with examples. Okay, for some further rules, a quotation should never stand alone. What does this mean? Is that avoid dropping quotes without any introduction or signal phrase. Always surround the quote with words. So don't just write a quote out of nowhere. You know, examiner is reading your paper and all of a sudden a quote shows up, comes up. That is not how you should do it. You should properly introduce a quote. And what do I mean by introduction, I will tell you later on, but for now, just keep this thing in mind. You know, you have to integrate a quote in your writing. Okay, it should be like a sandwich. Okay, just to give you an analogy, that it should be integrated. How? There should be some words, some sentences before the quote, which should most likely be introducing your quote, then once again some words which should be explaining the quote. And what do I mean by explanation, I will tell you later. It's not like you just start explaining the quote. No, this is something different, and I will discuss it in detail later on. So these you should keep in mind these points. You should never begin a paragraph with a quote. Okay, a paragraph should begin with a topic sentence, and a topic sentence is your own idea. It is the idea that is to be discussed in a paragraph. So it should be your own writing. It should never be a quote. You should always explain your quote after you properly cite it. Okay, of course, when you quote someone, you have to give their name, okay, and a brief one liner background, that you know what was their main domain, okay, for which they were, for which works they were renowned. So you have to, you know, give some reference about the authority also, but you also have to explain your quote. Do not end a paragraph with a quote. Okay, so the crux is, do not begin a paragraph with a quote, do not end a paragraph with a quote. Always write a quote within a paragraph, and I will discuss it with an example that why this strategy is good. So the concept of embedded versus is dropped in quotes. Students do this in the exam. They just drop in the quotes. Okay, all of a sudden a quote comes up. You know, examiner is reading your write up, and all of a sudden a quote comes up. But ideally, quotes should be embedded in your write up. Now, what do I mean by this? Is that an embedded quote flows naturally into your own writing. When reading a well embedded quote, it should sound like part of your own sentence. Okay. Now that is not. Now I'm not implying that you know you should plagiarize it. You should, you know, take it as your, to try to prove it as your own word, but it should sound like part of your own sentence. Okay, now what do I mean by this? I will elaborate it with examples. When written properly, the reader should not be able to hear from where the quotation marks are and where the sentences is read aloud. You know, the writer should not be able to hear where the quotation marks are when the sentence is read aloud. So if you're reading the sentence aloud, okay, then it shouldn't, you know, break the examiner's flow of your write up. You know, when he's reading your write up, it shouldn't break his flow by, you know, all of a sudden a quote is introduced and he has to stop and he has to read the quote, and once again he has to start all over again reading your write up. No, that shouldn't be done. A quote should be properly embedded. And what is that, what do I mean by this is that it should flow naturally in your write up. A properly embedded quotation creates an invisible link from the background information to the quoted material. Okay, before writing a quote, you should introduce the quote so that it is properly embedded. It sounds as a part of your write up. A dropped in quote, on the other hand, does not flow with the rest of the sentence. It sounds jarring and disrupts the sentence and paragraph. Okay, let me just discuss it with some examples and you will know it. So once again, the analogy which I gave you, a well integrated quote is a lot like a sandwich. On top, you have a sentence that is your own thought. Okay, when you start a paragraph, you should be starting it with your own thought, setting the context for the quote that you intend to use to prove or illustrate your point. So if you have a quote in mind and you have a thought of your own, then you first you write your thoughts, okay, your ideas, and then you set the context for the quote by introducing the quote briefly and then stating the quote, and that is how you can effectively prove and illustrate your point. Then you have the quote, with authors tags, signal phrase to back up your thought. Okay, so then you quote, then on the bottom you have a sentence of your own that reflects back on the quote. So you don't just write a quote and run away. You have to give the examiner something that what you intended to draw out of this quote, what point you were trying to make out of this quote. That is what the explanation part of the rule IQE means. Okay, that you have to tell the examiner that why did you put in the quote here. There is a method to your madness, so to speak. Okay, you wanted to prove something by this quote. Okay, that doesn't mean that you start repeating the quote like in this quote that Thomas Jefferson meant that. That's not what I mean by explanation. What I do mean is that you have to refer back that why you put in that quote. I will illustrate it with an example. Don't get confused right now. So always IQ it, introduce a quote, then put in the quote, and then explain the quote. Okay. So introducing the quote. The first part of our lecture should be about introducing the quote. So there are four different ways to properly and effectively introduce your quotations into writing. Okay. First of all, I told you that don't just drop in the quotes. Your quotes should be properly embedded. And how can they be properly embedded? By first you introduce the quotes, then you put in the quote, and then you give an explanation. So the first step is to introduce your quotes. And there are four different ways. You can introduce a quote with a complete sentence. You can introduce a quote with an explanatory phrase. You can use your quotes in your writing with only short quotes in your sentence. Okay, you put the quote within a sentence. Okay, you don't write an extra sentence for the quotes. I will tell you with example. Or you can your quote can be part of your quote can be paraphrased. Okay, some part of the quote which you think that it's not very important, you can paraphrase it, but some part of it in which you want the examiner to lay special emphasis, you can quote that. Okay, I will illustrate this with examples. Don't worry if you're not getting 100%. So introduce, first of all, just read the background of this quote, which I will be taking on when teaching you different rules. So to demonstrate how to introduce a quote, we will use an excerpt from Martin Luther King Jr.'s "I Have a Dream" speech. I hope all of you know who King was, and you might have listen to his speech also. So he was, if someone doesn't know him, let me just briefly tell you that he was a blacks rights activist in America. Okay, his struggle for gaining the rights of blacks and Negroes in America was universally recognized. Okay, so that is the context. Okay, and this speech was delivered by Martin Luther King Jr. in 1963 at Lincoln Memorial, Washington D.C. So this is just to warm you up before I officially start telling you the rules as to how to introduce a quote, how to embed a quote. This is the quote which we will be talking about throughout. Okay. So this is the actual quote which we will be using. Now students, what do students do? They are writing a paragraph, they give some space, they write a quote, they give some space, and then once again they start writing a paragraph. Now, this is the wrong approach. First, just read this quote which I am going to use for illustration purposes. Just pause it and read it. Pause the video and read it. So presuming that you have read it, the most important part is the content of their character. Okay, so I think I don't have to read it myself because I suppose you have read it. So now just move forward. Okay, the first method to introduce your quotes, which I discussed, was you introduce a quotation with a complete sentence. Now, if you introduce your quote with a complete sentence that describes the quotation or provides information about it, you must punctuate it with a colon before inserting the quote. So these are the different grammatical rules which you should be keeping in your mind. Remember, if you're writing a complete sentence, you use colon. If you're if you're not writing a complete sentence, you're writing a phrase before, then you put a comma before writing the quote. I hope you have done direct and indirect sentences in Précis and composition paper, and you know that sometimes before the quote a colon is written and sometimes a comma is written. Now the rule is basically that if the sentence before the quote is a complete sentence, that is the sentence stands on its own, then you should put in a colon. But if it's a phrase, it doesn't stand on its own, if you remove the quote, then you should put a comma. Let me illustrate with an example. So right now we are studying the first rule, that we are introducing a quote with a complete sentence. Here the example: in his dream I have a speech, dr Ma- in his dream I have a speech, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. had a dream. Now remember, this sentence in the highlighted in the blue, if you ignore the quote, it stand on its own. It is a complete sentence. It is a complete thought. Okay, remember, read it aloud once again and you will know that even if there is a full stop here in place of colon, it stand on its own even if the quote is not there. In his I have a dream speech, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. had a dream. Now that is a complete sentence. So you have introduced your quote with a sentence, you have put colons, and then you write the quote. Remember, in this instance, you can't write a comma instead of semicolons. Why? Because commas are used to connect ideas in a sentence. Okay, connect ideas through phrases. Okay, now it is a complete sentence, you must use colon. So these are the grammatical rules which you should adhere to when using the quotes. Number second, second methodology to introducing your quote was to begin with an explanatory phrase. Begin your sentence with a phrase that introduces the quote and then punctuate it with a comma before introducing the quote. So in this approach, we're introducing a quote not with a full sentence, but with an explanatory phrase. Explanatory phrase means that the phrase is explaining the quote. But since it's a phrase, we will be putting a comma before introducing the quote. Okay. So this is an example of introducing a quote with a phrase. Oh, in his famous I Have a Dream speech, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said, okay, now if you ignore the rest of the quote and just see the text in the blue, you will know that this is not a complete idea. Let me read it aloud for you. In his famous I Have a Dream speech, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said, now what did he say? Okay, You don't know that in this sentence. So it means that this is not a complete sentence. It does not convey a proper idea. So you should be using a comma here and not a colon. So rest of the quote is same, of course, but the rule is different. The grammatical rules are different. Thirdly, you can introduce your quote by including only short quotes in your sentence. Okay, now in I will elaborate this with example that you can only use the quote within a sentence. When including short quotations in your own writing, you should stick to just 2 to 4 word phrases. Okay, then if you are putting a quote within a sentence, then your quote should not be more than 2 to 4 words. Okay, place quotation marks around the author's original words and punctuate the sentence as you normally would. Now, you can pause if you want to, you know, read it once again, but let me move on and illustrate this with an example. Here, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. dreamed of a day when his children would only be judged by the content of their character. Now, in this case, let's suppose I feel that rest of the quote is not important. Okay, only the words content of their character is important. Okay, these are the words in the blue are important. So what I have done is that I have paraphrased the rest of his quote, including the introduction. I have also introduced that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said this. So Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. dreamed of a day when his children would only be judged by the content of their character. So this is effectively I am putting the quote in one sentence. And remember, these are just 4 to 5 word phrases. Okay, it shouldn't be longer than that. If it's longer than that, then you should be using the previous 2 techniques. That is, introducing the quote with a sentence or introducing a quote with a phrase. So there is another methodology, the fourth one and the last one, through which you can introduce your quote by paraphrasing it. Okay, begin your sentence by paraphrasing the quote and then finish the sentence with a quote. So once again, if you can paraphrase some part of the quote in your own words, and then you can write some part of the quote as it is, but the part of the quote which you're going to write as it is should be in the quotation marks. Okay, quotation marks. This is the example I was talking about. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. dreamed of a day when his 4 children would not be judged by the color of their skin but by the content of their character. So here I have paraphrased the quote initially. In his original quote, Dr. Martin Luther King dreamed of a day when this is the phrase which I have paraphrased, the one in the blue, when his 4 children. Remember, in the original quote, the word was my 4 children. But since I am paraphrasing it, instead of my, I would be using his. Remember once again the rules of direct indirect sentences. Okay, you convert I into his or we. So it's all about pronouns just to make the coherency. I'm teaching you these rules just so that your write up maintains a coherency while embedding the quotes, while introducing the quotes. So here I have used his because this is now out of the quotation marks, and I have to change the pronoun. Dr. Martin Luther King dreamed of a day when his 4 children. Now let's suppose I am using as it is. I'm not paraphrasing it. I am using my, and read it aloud. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. dreamed of a day when my 4 children would. Now this does not make sense. Okay, you have to you have to change the pronoun. If you want it my to be as it is, then use the other methods, that is introduced by a sentence or introduced by a phrase, so that you can write the entire quote as it is. But in this case, when I'm paraphrasing, I have to change it. Okay, and the rest of the quote is same, of course, not judged by the color of their skin but by the content of their character. Okay, now you know we know how to introduce the quote. We have also inserted the quotes, and now comes the last part, which is also the very important part, the explanation part. We don't just write the quote and run away, we have to explain it also. So now we are moving on to the last phase. So let's move on. After you introduce and write the code, you still need to explain the code. And what do I mean by explain? There are many ways to explain codes, okay? Provide analysis that connects the code to your main idea and topic sentence, okay? When you're providing the analysis or you're explaining the codes, that should effectively be connecting your code to the main idea. That is, it should directly or indirectly be touching the thesis statement of your essay, and it should be, redirecting itself. The explanation should be redirecting the code to the topic sentence of the paragraph, okay? And if you're not, if you have forgot what the topic sentence is, you can always refer back to the previous lectures. So what do I mean by explanation? Is that the code, it should provide an analysis, okay? The explanation should provide an analysis that connects the code to your main idea or your topic sentence. Explain why it is important and relevant, okay? Your explanation, which I'm talking about, that you have to explain the code, should effectively be explaining to the examiner why it is important and relevant, and make sure that the code supports your topic sentence, main idea, or thesis statement. So it should not be irrelevant, okay? So once again, why do we explain the code? For these three reasons. You can read these three reasons once again, but the thing is that you have to, link the code back to your main idea or to your topic sentence. So how do you make that link? By explaining the code. Let's move on. So here are some sentence starters to help you explain your code, okay? Now you can, after quoting, you can say that this proves that, this illustrates that, this shows that, this highlights the difference between. Now these are just a few phrases which I have, you know, I have written here. These are sentence starters. You can use a variety of other. Okay, this is just to give you the flavor that how you can start explaining the code. Okay, that you don't just write a quote and run away into your next paragraph. You have to explain the quote. You have to tell the examiner that why have you quoted it. Why have you quoted it? Because it explains, or it, strengthens your main ideas, your topic sentence, your thesis statement. So that is what you are doing effectively here. Okay, you're showing the examiner that why this quote was important. So another thing which you have to keep in mind is that you have to make your course grammatically consistent with the rest of your write-up. Now, what do I mean by this is that you can change a word in a code to make it grammatically consistent with your introduction. By introduction, I mean the introduction by which you are introducing the code. I don't mean it by, just to clarify your mind, I don't mean the introductory paragraph. By this I mean the introductory sentence in which you are introducing the code. So your code should be grammatically consistent with the introduction. The quote must support your thesis or topic sentence, otherwise it isn't relevant. So these are the two things which you have to keep in mind. Just move on and I will elaborate it with an example here. This is very important. I'm stressing this because this is very important, because at the end of the day your essay is all about coherency. Okay, all of the, if you're using present tense, then you should be using present tense throughout. If you're using past tense, then you should be using past tense. So that, let's just dwell into this example. Incorrect, this is an incorrect citation of a quote, incorrect embedding of a quote. It is not grammatically consistent. In his speech, Dr. King said, this is simple past tense, it will be fatal for the nation to overlook the urgency of this moment. Okay, now this is present tense, this is past tense. Now remember, of course, in the quote, it's about simple future tense, but the context is present tense. Okay, so if this is past tense, then this should also be past tense to make it grammatically consistent. So this is the correct example. In his speech, Dr. King said, past tense, and then this is the past tense. You know, would is the past tense form of will. Okay, it would be fatal for the nation to overlook the urgency of this moment. So, you know, in the original quote, this in the original quote, it was, it will be fatal. Okay, if you read his full speech, there was a phrase, it will be that was like this: it will be fatal for the nation to overlook the urgency of this moment. But in order to make it grammatically consistent, because we are introducing the quote in past tense, that is said and not say, in his speech, Dr. King said, now this would once again be converted into past tense to make it grammatically consistent. Okay, in his speech, Dr. King said it would be fatal for the nation to overlook the urgency of this moment. Now, what this grammatical consistency ultimately leads is, it makes your write up coherent. Okay, you know, your write up flows smoothly from the start till the end. You know, your quotes should not be disrupting your write up, either, you know, without introducing it. If you write a quote without introducing it, it will disrupt the flow of your write up. And secondly, if you do not, you know, change the quotation, the tense of the quote, to make it grammatically consistent, then once again the flow of your write-up will be disturbed, and that way examiner won't be impressed very much, he will be irritated. Okay, so the introduction, which is in the blue, and the quote, which is in the black, are grammatically consistent in the second example. So I hope the concept of grammatical consistency is now clear to you. So shortening a quote, as I told you that, you know, if the whole of a quote, you know, 3 to 4 sentences, you have memorized a quote of 3 to 4 sentences, and not all of it is relevant to the topic. There is a technique, and once again, this is a grammatically approved rules in English grammar, through which you can shorten a quote. You can eliminate the material which is not relevant to your thesis statement, to the main topic of your essay. Ellipses, okay, are three dots, okay, to indicate you have eliminated some words from the quotation. Note that there is a space between each dot. So the rule is, these are three dots, not two, not four, only three dots, and there is a slight space between each dot. Okay, so keep this in mind. This is the rule of ellipses. If you are also preparing for Prescient composition paper, which you must be, then you might be familiar with this rule. So we can also shorten the quotes by the usage of a grammatical technique called ellipses. So here, this is an example. In his book, The Capital Punishment, the author states that, quotes, capital punishment is the death sentence awarded for capital offenses like crimes involving planned murder, multiple murders, repeated crimes, rape and murder, etc., to such persons who are considered a gross danger to the existence of the society. Now, this is a quote. We are quoting something from a book, okay? But I feel like I have to shorten it. The text in the red, I feel that this is just a redundancy. You know, I can get away with and make my point clear. You know, the sole purpose of the quote is to beef up, to strengthen my stance, and I feel that I can strengthen my stance by, you know, omitting these words, because these words are just explaining the word capital offenses. These are just the examples of capital offenses. So I feel that I can just get away, I can just do as good by eliminating this fluff, so to speak. This is not very important, because all of this is summed up in the word capital offenses. So now read the shortened version. In his book, The Capital Punishment, the author states that capital punishment is the death sentence awarded for capital offenses, ellipsis, dot, space dot, to such persons who are considered a gross danger to the existence of the society. So I have removed or omitted the text in the red, because I have conveyed the message that what is capital punishment. It is death sentence awarded for capital offenses to people who are considered gross danger to the existence of society. Now, the word capital offenses is self-evident. Everybody knows it. What are the capital offenses? So I have conveyed my point to the examiner without being overly, complicated, that I am dwelling into, I'm also explaining what are capital offenses. But the point here was not to explain the capital offenses, but to explain what the capital punishment was. Okay, so I have eliminated the things which I think that not they are not very relevant to this code. So this is a way to shorten your codes. You use ellipses, which are, remember, 3 dots, not 2, not 4, only 3 dots, and there is a slight space in between them. So this is a visual representation of how you can properly embed a quote. Okay, you follow this simple equation to quote effectively. You introduce your quote. Remember, always introduce your quote. Never start a sentence with a quote. Okay, if you're writing a paragraph, never start a paragraph with a quote. If you're writing a sentence, never start a sentence with a quote. You have to first introduce it, then you put in the quote. You open and close the quote with quotation marks, and then you explain the quote. Always explain after the quote. Never end a paragraph with a quote. Why? Because if you're ending a paragraph with a quote, then it means that you're not explaining the quote. And when you're not explaining the quote, it means that the purpose of your quote, which was to justify to the examiner that your stance is right, is lost. Okay, you have just put in a quote, and you are assuming that the examiner would himself be connecting the dots, that how this quote is relevant to your thesis statement. Okay, don't leave anything to assumptions. Okay, just don't assume that the examiner would be connecting the dots by himself. No, he will penalize you for that, that you have written the quote and you haven't explained your intent, why you used that code, what were you trying to justify through that code. So that is where explanation comes in. That is why you should be explaining your codes. So these are some useful verbs which can be used to signal to the examiner that a quote is coming. Now remember, you don't always have to use said. Okay, like Martin Luther King said, or Qaid Azam said, or Noam Chomsky, let's suppose, who is a very famous critic, said, or Nelson Mandela said. There are other verbs also, which there are other signal verbs also which you can use. Okay, and these, vary from situation to situation. Okay, that what verb fits in a particular situation, it will depend. Okay, like if you are arguing something, okay, arguing a point, you can write that XYZ argues, in his book that. Okay, or if you're writing a counter argument, I hope you have already heard, you have watched the lecture about counter arguments. You can write that XYZ rejects this claim, okay, by saying this. So you can also use all of these verbs depending from situation to situation. You don't have to always use said. Okay, but only use these if you are dead sure that you are using them in the right context. Okay, otherwise, if you're not sure about the right context, that either these verbs are used in the right context, then use says or said. So you can pause the video and you can note down these on a piece of paper. So the final product, very important. This is an example of a body paragraph in which a quote is properly embedded. Properly embedded. Just read it. Now this is the topic sentence. Educating women is very important because it educates not only the particular woman being educated, but a whole nation. Now this was, remember, the topic sentence. I have not started the paragraph with the quote. Okay, because in the starting sentence or in the topic sentence should be telling the examiner my own idea, which I am going to discuss in this paragraph. So that should never be a quote. Okay, so here my topic sentence is that educating women is not just a benefit to that particular woman or a girl, but it has multiple effects. Okay, multiplier effects. So now these are some of the details I have written about this, the topic sentence, it is universally acknowledged that educating boys and girls, men and women, is morally right. But educating girls and women is especially effective, okay? Because when we educate them, the benefits are felt throughout the whole community. So this is an sort of background. I'm laying the background in which I am about to write a quote, so that my quote has a meaning to it, okay? It enhances, it supports my claim. So this is the introduction of the quote in the red. As Brigham Young, the famous United States religious leader, aptly said, you educate a man, you educate a man, you educate a woman, you educate a generation. So the text in the orange color is the quote, the text in the red is the introduction of the quote, and then this part from here till here is the explanation of the quote. This clearly underscores the importance of educating women as a magic multiplier in the development equation. Hence, it is clear that the benefits of investing in women's and girls' education flow not only to them but everyone around them too. So this is what I was talking about, explaining the quote. Now you don't just write this quote here and jump onto the next paragraph. You have to tell the examiner that what did you intend to achieve by writing this quote. You have to tell the examiner that what do you mean by this quote is that educating women has magic multiplier effect in the development equation. That if you educate a woman or a girl, it doesn't benefit only that particular woman or girl, but it benefits everyone around them, it benefits the community. Now remember, I have properly embedded this quote. Now if you read it in one go, just pause this video and you read it, it will naturally occur to you that the quote is not breaking the flow of your write up. Instead of, if you have written a paragraph, you know this is what just students, I have seen the students do. You leave some space, you write a quote, and then you start writing another paragraph. Just read this model and it will make it clear to you that why properly embedding a quote with introduction and later on by explaining it makes sense. Now remember, I didn't mean that by explanation you start explaining this quote like, in this quote what Brigham Young says, that if you educate a man, you educate a man, but if you educate, no, this is not what it meant by explanation. This would be like insulting the examiner. Frankly speaking, he knows what this means, okay? What you have to explain is that what you wanted to achieve out of this quote, and this is what you are trying to tell the examiner, that why educating women is important, and someone else, someone renowned has also said this. Now remember, I told you that you should have, if you're memorizing so much of quotes, then do please also remember a one liner about the background of the author or the authority being quoted. Why? Because it, excuse me, it gives the examiner an impression that this student is not just, excuse me, he doesn't have simply crammed up some quote and is reproducing it. He knows the person who said this, and he also knows his background, okay? So if you are using the as Brigham Young, comma, a brief introduction or brief background of the authority you're quoting, then once again comma. Remember, commas are also used in English grammar to provide additional information. So you're providing this additional information about the author. Aptly stated, okay, he aptly stated. So this, once again, I would like to reiterate that just read it once again, and also please write a one sentence, in one sentence or in a phrase, just give a brief background of the author. That will, lend credence to your write up. The examiner, it will reflect maturity on your behalf to the examiner, that this candidate knows what he's talking about. When he is referring to some authority, he knows them, he knows their work, okay? And moving on, an important note I would tell you, that quotes are used for support of points you are making, okay? Make sure that they do indeed support the points, that is, they are not irrelevant, and that they are smoothly woven into your writing, that is, they don't break the coherence of their write up. And how you can achieve it by following the equation I told you: introducing the code, inserting the code, and then explaining the code. You may need to follow the code with some explanation, just I told you, but do not insult the examiner by simply telling him what the code says. So I just told you what do I mean by this. So one frequently asked question when students ask is that, can they write the code, if they are writing their essay with a blue pen, can they write the code in black? I say yes, you can write the code with black pen, but don't use black marker. Okay, it will make it too fancy sort of, and overly color it. So if your write up is like this in blue, and you can write the code in black, just to highlight to the examiner that you have used a code. Okay, just to bring it to the examiner's fancy, to his attention, that you are quoting someone, so that his eye catches your code. So yes, you can write the particular code in black ink. So I just told you this because a lot of my students have asked me this question, that can we write the code in black? Well, you can use the code in black, there is no harm in it. Okay, so with this lecture ends. I hope you learned a lot from this lecture. I mean, students know that they have to put in quotes in current affairs paper. Now this lecture is not only useful for essay paper, believe me, this is also useful for any other paper. If you're quoting someone in Islamiyat, you're quoting a hadith, or a saying, let's suppose, or a Quranic verse. If you're quoting in Pakistan affairs, if you're quoting in any other subject, if you're quoting, this lecture is very useful for you, this lecture. But in essay, it matters specifically because essay is also a test of your grammatical, you know grammatical grip on English. Okay, it's also a test of your grammatical hold on the language. So you must know how to code properly. I hope you learned a lot of new things from this lecture, that how to code effectively. Okay, that everyone will be dropping quotes in their write up, believe me, but if you write these quotes in the way I taught you, in a very effective manner, believe me, they will make your write up stand out from the rest of the lot. Okay, so just practice using this in your write ups, just memorize this. You have to keep at the back of your mind these rules. Okay, these rules should be at your fingertips, but this is not very difficult thing to know. You just read the last paragraph and you will know the entire summary of this lecture, the body paragraph, the sample body paragraph which I have written. So for now, it's time to say goodbye. I will see you in the next lecture. Allah Hafiz.